we have a presentation by Dr. Michele Mioni on the history of social security worldwide between 1930 and 1915. I take this opportunity to greet Dr. Mioni and express our gratitude for his willingness to participate in this event. Perhaps some members of the audience may recall Dr. Mioni joined us on a panel during the Social Security Week in 2023, I'm sorry, with the presentation of the influence of the Beveridge Report on the development of Social Security systems. Undoubtedly, his work contributes to a deeper understanding of the global history on Social Security. I also extend my greetings to our moderator, Vanessa Storlinovsky, Executive Director of Projects and Research here at the CIS. For some members of our audience, it might seem peculiar that we dedicate a session of our seminar to analyze process that took place almost a century ago. However, at the General Secretariat of the CIS, we are convinced that historical analysis is one of the key tools at our disposal to understand many of the characteristics of contemporary social security. Perhaps one of the most important historical period of the development of the topic at hand is the one our panelists will analyze today, which, as he will explain, constitutes the time frame in which Social Security came to be on a global scale. During this time, significant events occurred. For instance, the enshrinement of the human right to Social Security in Articles 22 and 25 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, or the publication of the Beveridge Report in 1942. In the American continent, we find the establishment of social security systems in many countries, such as Canada, Colombia, Costa Rica, the United States, Mexico, Panama, Paraguay, Peru, and Venezuela. It was also in this era that the CIS was founded in Santiago de Chile in 1942. While several of the American social security systems have undergone substantial reforms since then, institutional legacies persist, exerting long-standing effects on their functioning to this day. For these reasons, we believe that it is relevant to revisit this foundational period. I am nothing but presenting these topics. Of course, it is our panelist, Dr. Mioni, who will explain them in detail. I express my gratitude to the CIS staff who make the celebration of this seminar and the development of all our activities possible. I highly value their effort and dedication. Once again, I extend my thanks to our panelists and above all, to the audience who have been following our activities for several years. I invite you to respond to the satisfaction survey at the end of the seminar to provide us with valuable feedback and enhance our events. And finally, I invite you all to visit our website where you can find materials and tools aimed at strengthening American social security systems. I conclude and officially declare inaugurated the 2024 cycle of the Permanent Seminar on Welfare in the Americas. Good morning, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Secretary General. Before I introduce you to Michele, let me give you a general information about this webinar. We speak now in English, or we try so at least, but we have a translation. So if you go into the Zoom and click on the little word that is beneath the main screen, you can choose which language you can hear and listen to the seminar. So, well, that's for the general announcements. And as our Secretary General prompted out, our main panelist is Michele Mioni, who has been with us earlier, if I'm not wrong, last year, talking about informality. But well, Michele Mioni is currently Research Associate at the Center of Social History of Contemporary Worlds. in the Sorbonne University and at the Center for Comparative International Studies at the University of Venice. He taught classes on contemporary history, historical methods for social sciences, and global history of social policy. His main research interests are the history of social policy and the history of trade unions in the 20th century. His most recent publications include a monograph entitled Social Reform, the Fight Against Fascism, Cooperative Suggestions, the General Confederation of Labor in Italy and Europe from 1918 till 1927, and a co-authored article on the transnational circulation of the Beveridge Report in Canada, France, Denmark. He is co-editor of a forthcoming volume published at Palgrave on the mixed economy of welfare and the aid to the social marginalized in interwar Europe. I said earlier he was with us talking about informality, but no, he was with us talking about the Beveridge Report. But well, thank you so much, Michele, for being virtually with us today. May I ask you where you are, Paris or Venice?
I am in Venice now, yes.
Bueno, ahora estoy.
Thank you so much. I have to tell you, you have approximately 50 minutes for your exposition. After that, we may have some questions from the audience that I will address to you. So the venue is yours. Please go ahead. Thank you so much, Michele.
Thank you very
Gracias.
much. Thank you very much. And good morning or good evening to everyone, depending on the time hour. I also, of course, I want to thank the CIS and to thank the Secretary General and the Executive Director of Project and Research for inviting me, and in particular also Miguel Ramirez, who reached out to me and offered me this the opportunity to give this talk today. I have to say that I'm very honored by this invitation, of course, and by the opportunity to give this talk, this seminar in front of this wider audience, which I think is composed also by experts and other academics. So I'm very glad, and I'm really thankful for this opportunity. Now I will try to share my screen, and let me know it should be now visible to everyone. Yes. Well, in this talk of about 45 to some 50 minutes, I will try to cover some aspect of, as the Director General recall, of this global funding moment of social security between the 1930s and the 1950s. Indeed, I would say that more than a founding moment is a prolonged period of time where this dynamic concept, which is social security, and I mentioned the dynamic concept because that was also what the actors of that time, how the actors of that time defined social security, the moment where this concept was created, spread, and finally was to some extent standardized. A process where, by the way, the CIS and the government of North, Central, and South America played a primary role. So also for this reason, I'm very honored to be here today, because the CIS was one of the protagonists of this project, of this process. Now, the title of my intervention is Social Security Throughout the World, 1930s, 1950s, Ideas, Policies, and Actors. So here, for this specific seminar, I won't dwell too much on the methodological debate, even if in the conclusions I included a short bibliography, by the way, mostly available online. So if some of you want to check this aspect, I will. I let the reference, the relevant references. I will limit myself just to mentioning that in the last, I would say, 20 years, the historiography on the welfare state, and also the political scientists who study welfare state, have shifted the focus of analysis from national institutions and national policies to the broader, I would say, global or at least transnational frameworks. And this perspective seems to me at least particularly effective in reconstructing the creation, the spread, and the subsequent, as I mentioned, standardization of social security during these 2 decades. A period of time that, again, is very relevant to understand the origins of today's social security. Why? Well, from an intellectual point of view, the conceptualization, I would say, of social security went through several stages, several steps. In these 2 decades, events such as the Great Depression, the Second World War, or the looming decolonization process and the looming also the incipient, the early Cold War, shaped the idea of social security. And consequently, social security policies also improved and expanded according to this process, I would say, of mutual learning, of exchanges, and of cross-fertilization. I mean, really mutual exchanges and mutual transfers among different models and different systems of social security. As well as, I mean, a process that was favored by also an important number of international conventions or at least agreements on this topic. Before diving into the main historical narrative, I would say, or reconstruction, just a few words about the actors of social security, because this approach, this transnational approach, I think, lends itself to a greater emphasis on the role of supranational actors. This is, of course, the case with the International Labour Office or International Labour Organization, sorry, the ILO, as well as other international organizations such as the International Social Security Association or the same Conferencia Interamericana de Seguridad Social. I'm sorry for my Spanish, but at least it's understandable. The later is more like a regional actors, but it's still an international organization, of course. So it, by all means, I would say, comparable to the ILO or to the ISSA. Of course, beside this main player, I would say there is a myriad of other transnational actors. I think, for instance, about the INGOs, or private foundations, such as very famous the Rockefeller Foundation. But these later actors, I mean, INGOs or private foundations, seems to me to be less relevant, at least if we deal with social security, so to say, stricto sensu, and more important if we consider social policy at large, thinking about the work of this foundation against social diseases or healthcare or educational policies and so on and so forth. But really, in this presentation, of course, I want to limit myself to social security. So for this reason, I won't dive too much into other players. Oh, sorry. Sorry. Now, I would like just to spend a few words at least about the ILO, an organization which is central in this account, an organization which was created in 1919, just after the Great War, as a part of the League of Nations. And one of the few organizations, if not the only one probably, of organization of this multilateral system which survived the Second World War, and therefore one of the organizations which still nowadays deals with the global governance of labor and social policy. This organization has a tripartite structure that associates governments and social partners from the member states, and in this capacity it adopts convention that legally oblige the governments which signs this compact to enforce the provisions of the convention. It's worth saying that at the very beginning, the ILO was originally created to promote international standards for labor and social protection, but it soon became a real forum to discuss, let's call it the global social policy, and one of the main players in these exchanges of ideas and practices of social insurance. At the very beginning, also, especially in the 20s, the ILO, which was based in Geneva as part of the League of Nations, was mainly staffed with European experts and was mostly influenced by the German model of social insurance, therefore grounded on this key role of the health insurance as a foundation for the other branches that composes social security. So the main idea was that social insurance system would be incrementally established, I would say branch by branch, according to the historical examples of the main European settings that generally started with the health insurance, old age pensions, workmen's compensation, all the way up to the unemployment insurance, which is, I would say, the most complicated insurance to set up, because it requires some sort of expertise and structures that not all the state could afford at that time. Of course, this was mainly a fictional, an ideal type that did not really took into consideration the significant variation across the different countries. Of course, other important actors in all this were the international social security associations, which also at the very beginning was mainly a European organization which gathered both public and private social insurance funds. We will see later also the evolution of this actor, and eventually the SIS, which was founded in 1942 with the aim of expanding social security in the Americas. Now, after this very introductory information and remarks, let's dive into the actual intellectual background of social security, which rooted in the interwar economic crisis, when the economist Abraham Epstein allegedly coined this notion, this term, somewhere between 1931 and 1932, against the backdrop of the socioeconomic conditions of the United States at that time. Epstein conceived a system that integrated social insurance and assistance methods, and that he pitted explicitly against the European model, or better, the German model, based on occupational funds and on income differences, and which, how can I say, highlight the role also of the professional status in accessing social benefits. While social security, and here I quote from Epstein, promotes the welfare of society as a whole, as Epstein was convinced that no improvement in the condition of labor can come except as the security of the people as a whole is advanced. End of the quote. By the way, some scholars remarked that this very approach, where the solidarity element is very emphasized, was somewhat influenced by the solidarity discourses and practices originated by the Soviet Revolution that Epstein himself analyzed, because he was a US migrant of Russian origins, and here I included the reference to the literature on this topic. Beside this kind of intellectual contextualization of the rise of social security, I mentioned that the backdrop for all this reflection was the Great Depression. And it is just in the framework of the New Deal, so this huge program of economic and social recovery from the aftermath of the Great Depression, that the Congress passed the Social Security Act in 1935, introducing for the first time, as far as I know, this label, the term Social Security, in a legislative act, in a piece of legislation. It's worth mentioning that this act only partially turned Epstein's principle into policy. And in fact, as many scholars also remark, it was a watershed. I mean, the Social Security Act was a watershed only for the US context, which was still lagging behind the most advanced social system, European social system. However, the US Social Security, regardless of its effective achievements, was studied by social reformers in Europe, in Latin America, and even in Asia. Here, I just quickly mention an article published by another European expert, an Austrian European expert, and he also migrated in the US, who was Karl Pribram, who in the ILO's monthly review wrote a first comparative article which tries to find out the elements for a comparison, similarities and differences between social insurance and social security. So for the first time, devised as two, I would say, separate approaches to social issues, to the social question. According to Pribram, Roosevelt's Social Security, the Social Security had at least the merit to paving the way to a brand new field of political experimentation. It was a testing ground for new methods, for new policies, which would prove, according to him, particularly useful, especially to the countries which, unlike in Europe, didn't have necessarily a long tradition and a long stratification of social legislation. So that was a possible blueprint for reform from scratch in many countries. And indeed, Central and Southern American countries were early regions, were early areas of diffusion and of conceptualization of social security. By the mid-30s, let's say, more or less, the efforts of these countries were framed within Pan-American or inter-American initiatives that at that time included social security as a part of this renewed economic, diplomatic, and cultural cooperation across the Americas, which was also part of the Roosevelt administration program, part of the Roosevelt administration foreign policy. Why I mention the role of the diplomatic framework and of foreign policy in all this? Well, because just in the same period, in 1935, the United States also joined the ILO, favoring or setting in motion at least this drift from Europe to the Americas in terms of personnel, of expertise, of methods, but also of concept of social policy. Now, here I won't enter too much into the detail, but I left the reference of a book published in 2020 by Veronique Plata-Stenger, which is, by the way, fully available online, that dives deeper into the activities of the ILO in the Americas, including the assistance missions, the studies, and also these complex relationships between Geneva and the rising inter-American organization. But it's true that just at that time, also the ILO, so also this European-based organization, took an interest in the underlying principles of the rising social security that were discussed in the American continent. Here, I should at least refer to the conference of the ILO member states of the region, which took place in Santiago de Chile in 1936. and which provided an early, I would say, working definition of social security as a policy based on compensation from and prevention of the workers' loss of income, and as a policy of restoration of their working capacity. So as you can see, this is a comprehensive approach that aimed, I would say programmatically, aimed to overcome the narrower, the more limited goals of European insurance, which mainly focused on just compensation. Again, this is to some extent an oversimplification, because also European countries were setting up health services or medical care. But it's true that if we stick to the social insurance, the European goals were way more limited than the prospective agenda of social security in the America. And while this conference, the conference in Santiago, established, delivered that social insurance sat at the heart, like the foundation of social security, the proceeding of the meeting displayed the political aim for a broader policy that connected more closely social insurance and healthcare, and that would generalize sooner or later, I mean, that was a kind of an incremental program, generalize protection to the whole population, ideally. So here I think that we may highlight two relevant points. First, this conference combined the established, mainly European expertise in this field with new ideas that were mostly stranger to the European tradition. Just an example, the European legacy, which was embodied at that time by the ILO, of the insurance-based methods and the centrality of health insurance, met the emphasis put on the medical care and of the weakening of a too tight link between contributory record and social benefit, which was indeed an innovation that was that was emerging from this inter-American debate. And this goal, by the way, resonated with the kind of reformism that the ILO had embraced in those years. And second point, the conference accompanied a new wave of social reform that included countries like Mexico, Peru, Colombia, Costa Rica, which tried to adapt the social security guidelines to their specific local condition, and it also, the conference further the flow of information among national agencies. Here I can just mention the name of the Peruvian expert Edgardo Rebagliati, who for sure you know more than me, was technical expertise would later inspire also social security reform in post-colonial areas well after the end of the Second World War. So in that period, I would say that the seeds for I would say a developmental approach to social security were also planted. So far, I mainly focused to the American and to some extent to the transatlantic context, but an overview of pre-1939 social security wouldn't be complete without mentioning New Zealand, which surely more than every other country actually endorsed Epstein universalist idea. Between 1938 and 1939, New Zealand passed the first all-inclusive scheme that covered all citizens with medical care and that strengthened non-contributory schemes, especially the old age pension, and also introduced the family allowances. So this model, why is it important? Because this model introduced the idea that the state should provide the whole population with, I use the semantic of the time, with adequate protection. So New Zealand's experiment became the actual blueprint for subsequent innovation, and there is significant documentary evidence. If you want, we can discuss later in the Q&A that even before the outbreak of the war, New Zealand was studied by government and international agency as a model of social security. Now, I just refer so far to the developments that preceded 1939. Why? Well, the Second World War is indeed the main watershed in this story. The fight of the Allies against the Axis powers opposed two visions of society, as it was emphasized by the propaganda on both sides. Social policy featured prominently in the Nazi new European order, so in the Nazis' project for the post-war settlement, and even the satellites and the puppet governments of Nazi Germany claimed that a new social order would rise from the ashes of the war and from the victory of Nazi Germany. That was the narrative also at the time. On the other side, social security became a staple of the Anglo-American propaganda and Anglo-American discourses. This transatlantic dialogue wasn't by no means limited to London and Washington, but it included Latin American and Commonwealth countries. And that was a dialogue that fine-tuned the political and also to some extent the technical features of social security and mainly how to incorporate social security in the post-war multilateral order and reconstruction plans to strengthen the fabric of democracy, to strengthen the democratic institution. The 1941 political manifesto called Atlantic Charter proclaimed that social security and freedom from want were leading principle for the post-war international relations and for the post-war labor and social policy. The calls upon freedom from want was a clear reference to President Roosevelt's rhetorics to the four freedoms that should be ensured worldwide. And they in fact reveal how social security was now a tool of the propaganda to counter the Axis during the war. A tool of propaganda which nonetheless was taken very seriously by the Allied governments, which used these general watchwords to outline their own national programs and reforms. And the most well-known document was the so-called Beveridge Report in Britain. This text proposed a coordinated system of social insurance, healthcare, and social service that was expected to include all citizens regardless of their social status and income. This new setting was expected to provide a minimum vital income through social insurance and medical care through a national health service funded by the general revenue. And these measures overall, in the semantic of the times, were designed to free from want the British citizens. Now, if I have to say, the Beveridge Report has been seen in hindsight, so after the end of the war, as the document that conceptualized the social rights of citizenship. However, this expression was never, the expression social right was never used in the report, and Beveridge himself never actually liked the expression welfare state, for instance. From his liberal point of view is quite understandable, because for these British liberal reformers, they firmly believed that social security should limit itself to ensure the basic minimum, and that it was up to the individual to get better protection through voluntary schemes. So a very liberal framework after all. Not to mention income redistribution, which was not the goal of the plan, and in fact, social insurance ran according to a flat rate benefits for equal contribution, and probably the only mildly redistributive and genuinely solidarity measure was the free and universalist national health services funded by the taxes. As far as the citizenship issue, actually, Beveridge believed that social security was a right of every citizen, but we should frame this consideration in his idea of a full employment society where ideally every adult citizen was also a worker, because that was a society of full employment where only some less than 3% of the population was not employed. So it's true, social security was a right of all the citizens as long as they were also worker, as they were expected to be worker. So why this exaggeration of the effective scope of the Beveridge report? Well, that was perhaps due to the relevance of this document during the war, as it was widely used for domestic and international propaganda and circulated across the US, the countries of the Commonwealth, and Latin America as well. Here, the Beveridge report found fertile ground because social security was widely discussed since many years. Just in 1939, when Europe sunk into the war, the American countries gathered in La Havana, in a second regional meeting sponsored by the ILO to discuss the development of social security in the continent. And the war also prompted the internationalization of this issue. So in 1941, the ILO moved to Montreal and endorsed the Allied social program, and the ILO pursued its technical diplomacy and brokered the exchanges across the Atlantic and the Pacific. For instance, ILO experts also advised on technical matters concerning the Beveridge report and other reform projects. In that respect, I think it's important to mention at least a meeting of experts that took place in 1943 in Montreal. I found the proceeding of this meeting in the archives of the ILO in Geneva, as this gathering wasn't expected to be public, actually. And on that occasion, civil servants from the Anglophone, from the English-speaking and the Latin American countries discussed issues and perspective of social security. I have to say that this meeting really gathered the most senior officers of the time, with the exclusion of New Zealand and Australian officers, because the English-speaking experts were Wilbur Cohen, Arthur Altmaier, Beveridge himself, John Haggerty, and Leonard Charles Marsh, while the Latin American counterparts were, just mentioning a few names, Fidel Alberto López Arteta from Ecuador, Rebagliati from Peru, Oscar Saraiva from Brazil, Vicente Santos Gallardo from Mexico, José de Sandoval from Cuba, Miguel Echevarne from Chile, and another name. And in this very meeting, this expert agreed that social security could be defined as a human right. And as such, the term was associated to the democratic and liberal systems and to the struggles of the democracies against the Axis power, and I would add, against communism as well. In fact, this universalist vision of social security, to some extent conveniently, concealed slightly different positions of the expert and the realization that it was impossible to devise a unified system of social security that could equally achieve social security in different geographical, social, and cultural contexts. Beside this more restricted and non-public meeting, this topic was also debated in official forum. Here, I think it is relevant to mention the two Inter-American conferences on social security, which took place in Lima in 1940 and in Santiago de Chile in September 1942, a few weeks before, by the way, the publication of the Beveridge report. And this last conference, this later conference, is particularly important because it adopted 16 resolutions. And here I would particularly highlight those that established international cooperation. So the countries resolved to create the Inter-American Conference of Social Security, the CIS, and a permanent Inter-American Committee on Social Security. And the delegates also sought to promote greater intergovernmental collaborations in fields like, for instance, the healthcare. So this internationalization of social security issues was due to a very important awareness established during the war, that is that mass unemployment and widespread destitution, so social insecurity, were not just domestic matters, but they affected also international politics and international economy. The conference therefore hoped that the national governments would manage to achieve basic security across the continent. Why? Because domestically, social security was expected to achieve, I quote, a genuine and rational economy of human resources and value, end of the quote. While internationally, the eradication of want, it was hoped that the eradication of want would help in creating a multilateral and democratic framework and to stabilize the international relations as well. So we can grasp how the features of social security changed during the war, being identified as a more socially inclusive democracy as opposed to totalitarianism. So it was to many extent the Second World War that created social security as a universal human right. And not for nothing, the Second World War was also the context that created the United Nations, which sought at that time to establish a global governance of social and economic issues and to establish universal human rights at the foundation of the post-war multilateral order. And you can see how well social security would fit in this agenda. So already in 1944, the International Labour Conference held in Philadelphia officially stated that social security, generally defined as a combination of provisions that included insurance and medical care, sat at the core of the post-war social policy. More interestingly, for us, however, the conference also decided to come up with a definition of social security terms and standards. Why this is interesting for us? Well, because with this step was required to expand technical assistance and the ILO's action to regions of the world where different stages of development made European and American approaches unpractical. And this is also a legacy of the war because the circulation of wartime reform projects led to the reception of social security ideas and policies to all corners of the world, including in the colonial areas, in the colonial countries. And this process entailed a cumbersome process of revision and readaptation of social security principles to local contexts, where this notion did not define everywhere the same goal and the same policies. This allows me to enter the last part of my presentation, where I have to say I will focus more on the ILO because of the overwhelming role it play in this step. But I have to say that if you want, we can discuss later also the role of other organizations such as the ISSA, which became Social Security Association just in 1947, and of the CIS as well. I check again in the repositories of the ILO in Geneva. I checked, and the ILO hoped to make of the CIS and of the ISSA the American and the European, I would say, regional branches of the ILOs for this sort of cooperation in the development and the promotion of Social Security. So my focus now will be mainly on the ILO. We should not neglect also the role of this regional or collateral organization in this process. However, after the war, many governments should operationalize the project previously outlined. European countries, for instance, grafted social security reforms onto their policy legacies, ideas of solidarities, and technical solutions. As a matter of fact, even if during and just after the war, all political parties and governments claimed to commit to Social Security, in most cases, the reforms pursued in a, I would say, rather incremental and piecemeal fashion, rather than with a unified approach. Amongst the European countries, Great Britain and France passed the more wide-ranging projects. In Britain, where the Labour government laid the foundation of the British welfare state between 1947 and 1931, while in France, the so-called Plan de Sécurité Sociale, so Social Security Plan, was devised by Pierre Larocque. In an article of the ILO's review, Larocque recognized that even relatively similar countries like France and Britain design systems that address different national priorities. The French plan, for instance, retained a very strong occupational framework along the lines of the Bismarckian models. And in other European countries, such as Italy or Germany, the solidarity goals of Social Security were basically discharged, at least just after the war. In the United States, too, once the wartime mobilization made way for the return, let's say, of party politics, the most ambitious draft, including, for instance, the introduction of the health insurance, were withdrawn from the political agenda. And this task to standardize the minimum terms and definition proved even more complicated in what nowadays we call Global South. I mentioned that the ILO recognized that in newly independent countries in South Asia, Middle East, or North Africa, Social Security could not be achieved just through social insurance, because this country needed to improve first their healthcare, their education, and their assistance infrastructure. And moreover, it was recognized that economic development and modernization were also needed before even thinking about implementing a full-fledged social security system. And for this reason, ever since the war years, the ILO planned to hold regional conferences that would help adapt social security imperatives across a world of local and regional variations and specific needs. In 1933, they identified South and Southeast Asia as a pilot area where to develop this strategy. And in 1947, the preparatory Asiatic Regional Conference in New Delhi, featured the participation of both newly independent countries, colonial possessions, as well as delegates of the European colonial powers, Australia and New Zealand. On that occasion, it was stated that social security was this dynamic concept I was referring earlier, associated to freedom from want. And to operationalize this goal, the freedom from want, the conference resolved to launch the technical assistance programs, which were comprehensive state-building packages that include social security, vocational training, medical care, training of local experts and employees. And as shown by several studies, here I mentioned just one of them, these technical assistance programs were not stranger to the looming Cold War dynamics, which broke out just in the same year of the conference in New Delhi. I just mentioned here that Soviet Union was not a member of the ILO at that time, and that secretary of the ILO was a former New Dealer, the US David Morse. So his strategy aimed to provide these countries with assistance to drive economic modernization and social development the ILO way, that is mainly the Western way. Here, I won't dwell too much into this topic, but it's true that the post-war years experienced feature a growth in international assistance programs, such as Truman's Point 4 programs or other similar initiatives that former colonial powers and communist organizations developed, especially in the 1970s, and which were labeled as economic development aid. However, the expansion of social security through national and international agencies after 1945 was framed within these competing developmental agendas and within what can be called a sort of systemic competition between the West and the communist bloc in this field. Here, in the slide, I just mentioned the most relevant assistance program launched by the ILO or by other UN agencies on social security, and particularly the pilot program to Burma that set to some extent the standards for other programs that not for nothing took place in other countries of this area as soon as they reached political independence. So you can see the state building approach that accompanied this program. Now, I won't focus too much on the technical details, but one point at least I would like to mention is that how the ILO approach, I mean, the centrality of this ILO idea of the health insurance as a linchpin of this program, which indeed were based on the introduction of health insurance, old age pensions, workmen's compensation to limited urban area, to only gradually be expanded to other risk and geographical areas that ended with the creation of labor exchanges and unemployment benefits. So here it is relevant to mention that these programs required adaptations and adjustments to the local conditions. So, for instance, unemployment for seasonal workers like the farmers in Burma was not the same as unemployment for industrial workers, say, in Manchester or any other Western industrial city. So, in these cases, social security meant as freedom from want rather than a specific technical arrangements should be conceived and set up with different means adapted to the local context. And just to address, I'm coming to the conclusion in some 10 minutes. Just to address these multifaceted characters of social security, which, as you can see, had some very practical consequences. The ILO experts were also discussing international standards and conceptual methods to lay the technical basis for Convention 102, which was approved in 1952. For expert here, I still mention Larocque. For expert like him, who he led the works of the expert committees within the ILO, a new convention was needed because the advancement of the last 20 years, so the advancement from the 1930s onward, made outdated the previous convention on separate branches of social insurance, which moreover were mainly inspired by the European social insurance scheme. According to him, according to all these experts, that European model did not address want, because its underlying occupational separatism limited the access to medical care, it strongly linked contribution to benefit, and it focused mainly on wage earners. So the prior convention no longer represented the current trends and standard for post-war development. So pre-war, for instance, operational principle didn't embed social insurance within this national policy to raise the people's standards of living. So the expert believed that the establishment of general minimum and optimum standard would help the governments to improve or to create social security systems. This division between minimum and optimum standards concern all the technical aspects: risk cover, condition to right to benefit, methods of income security and medical care, the rates and the duration of benefits. So these standards were based on the coeval trends that require updating the international instrument. And the proposed convention, facing with this world of diversity of occupational separatism, the proposed convention aimed so to confirm the principles of unity, of comprehensiveness, and of adequacy that were established by the Declaration of Philadelphia in 1944. And this convention was expected to allow member states to pursue these general principles gradually. So by setting comparatively low standards of provision at the date of ratification, it also accommodated or tried to accommodate the difficulties encountered in underdeveloped countries in achieving social security. Of course, this was, I would say, the view, the triumphalistic view of international experts. However, the debate, as always, on social security went on for 2 good years within and outside the ILO, featuring opposing stance both between employers and unions and among countries. So eventually, Convention 102 established this unifying framework for minimum standard attainable by all countries, regardless of the economic development. In the slide, as you can see, I mentioned some elements, the core element of this convention, which was, by the way, kind of vague on purpose on distinctive points constituting social security, because it prioritized a more pragmatic approach to fit to national particularism over the universal ideas of the Declaration of Philadelphia. By the way, it must be said that only 8 countries ratified all the protocols of Convention 102, at least in the 1950s, and almost all of them were European countries. Now, Convention 102 seems to me an appropriate watershed to conclude this account, because it departed from the more political and ideal arguments that foster social security as it had been conceived during the war years. In the newly independent countries, the state-building projects embedded social security in a wider developmental agenda, while in Western Europe, and in a different way, I would say also in the communist bloc, the unexpected period of economic growth led to the construction of welfare state, which I think are something quantitatively and qualitatively different from social security. Now, in these very conclusive remarks, I start by mentioning the 2001 ILO's resolution and conclusions concerning social security, which maintained that social security is a basic human right, attainable through different social provision and depending on national and cultural context. The resolution stated that social security evolved over time, as we have seen, by the way, and that social assistance, universal schemes, social insurance, and public or private provision could equally ensure income security and access to healthcare, as long as these systems conform to some basic principle, like not being non-discriminatory, transparent management, the involvement of social partners in the administration of the scheme. In this short talk, I try to dive deeper just into this origin, into these dynamic origins of the formation of this notion, analyzing both the ideological aspect and their practical implementation. I think that a fundamental point, which is also recalled in the 2001 resolution, is that the universalist goals inherent to social security coexisted with a more cumbersome, difficult process to concretely operationalize this principle across a variety of regional, cultural, and social differences. And another and last issue I would like to raise concerns the actors that disseminated ideas and policies of social security. Of course, I confine myself again to the most relevant player, but what I think is worth emphasizing is that the making of the concept of social security was primarily the result of a collective, and I would say transnational effort. So rather than the diffusion of a specific or individual European or inter-American model, the mutual exchanges and influences among different methods and approach actually shaped social security, as apparent by, let's say, the account, the story we're just seeing, and as apparent by the very content of this post-war technical assistance program. So that's, I would say, a part of this story which is probably not yet unfolded entirely and more thoroughly through a more consistent historical and archival driven investigation. But, and very, very last point, this also seems very relevant to me when it comes to provincialize, let's say, the concept of social security, because the public and academic debate in Europe tends to highlight how welfare state and social security are almost some identity traits that allegedly define a very theoretical European social model that is different and implicitly better than other models across the world. Here, I believe that globalizing the history of social security would help to avoid this form of ethnocentrism and to rethink a broader history of this idea and of this policy in all its exchanges and in all its relevant actors. And now, really to conclude, here I propose a very basic literature and references, most of them available online if you want to dive a little bit deeper into this framework. I just would like to thank you for your attention, and here I am for any Q&A or contribution from your part. Thank you very much.
Michele,
Yeah.
wonderful explanation of what happened during this global funding moment, 20 years just after the Great Depression and in between wars, and of course during the Cold War. I now go to the questions from the audience. I will read them to you if you allow me.
Thank you very much.
Okay, the first one is, could you elaborate on the reasons for the innovations in the American case? What is the reason for a region that was just beginning to establish its systems to propose avant-garde policies? And I have another question that goes together with this one, and it is, what about the American momentum? Would you probably say that the poor success of the American systems measured by informality rates is due to the wider vision about social security they had comparing with Europe and opposed to that of Asia?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for this question. Well, elaborating, that's just one of the points I refer in the conclusion. That's a story which is in good part still untold. I can advance some possible interpretation based on, of course, the existing literature, but here more research is really needed. Here, I think that the spread of social security in the Americas was part of this global moment, which was the New Deal. I mean, there is now a wealth of literature that analyze not only the many links and transfer that made the New Deal, but also how this was, in fact, also an asset for the global projection of the U.S. Throughout the war during the Roosevelt administration. And I think that we can, on the one side, we can understand the spread of social security across the Americas as part of this foreign policy fostered by the Roosevelt administration that I mentioned earlier in my short presentation. On the other side, I also think that for the Latin American social reformers, because my idea, I mean, I'm not an expert of Latin American history, so please, I beg your pardon if I make some mistake, but we often think about the relation between Northern America and Central and Southern America as a sort of top-down relation. In fact, it's a story of transfer, which went northward as well as southward. And I think that this idea of social security also fit well into the agenda of this social reformer, Rebagliati, Allende himself, and many others, who were just starting creating, let's say, a social insurance system, and social security just offer this sort of unified approach to this issue. By the way, we should also differentiate between Latin American and Central American countries, because countries such as Argentina, Uruguay, Chile, Brazil, they already started developing insurance system in the 20s, at least from the 20s, while other just entered this new wave in the 30s. And in this sense, the Inter-American Conference were really watershed that at least favor the further development of this system. If I can mention a primary source which has a value, I mean, a limited value, of course, we should integrate with more sources. I mentioned this article by Carl Pribram, which, by the way, is still available online, which I would say, hidden through this very technical and actuarial arguments, also mentioned the fact that social security seemed to him a method which were particularly valid for countries like the US, but the same may apply to other American countries, which didn't have this very strong and stratified and incremental social legislation. So, of course, for a country like Germany, which already have 50 years of social insurance development, was way more difficult to start from scratch with a system that could renew the existing system. And by the way, if I may say, Germany is one of those countries where this social security approach is kind of, if not rejected, mediated by this sort of occupational system. And in this sense, I think that we can also understand this wider vision of the social security reform. And so this idea that social security must address, must cover and protect the whole population, and not just wage earners or limited categories, which were the main target of the European social insurance system. So that was the great, I would say, the great idea underpinning social security, which during the war, of course, met with the wider political agenda of the Allied government. And so this idea of a more inclusive system that aimed to cover the whole population was quite conveniently, I would say, can be identified with a human right and with a staple or a defining features of the democracies against totalitarianism. So my idea is that there is a combination of technical reason, historical reason, but also political reason that allowed, I would say, the establishment of social security as a paradigm.
Thank you so much, Michele. I go to the next question from the audience. This is a shorter one, but maybe with a longer answer. What are the main legacies of this period on current trends in social security around the world?
Okay, that's a very short question. I'm afraid it will remain for good part unanswered, because still I think we lack an effective global history of social security, which could span all across the world. I can propose a possible periodization, which is the founding moment. We can define it like this. So these first 20 years where there was a technical debate, but there was also a relevant political and ideological discussion surrounding social security, which I tried to convey. Then after, when we enter also the Cold War, as I mentioned, social security became not only part of this competition, but also, I would say, almost a technical tool in the implementation of this state building project or developmental project as well. So something that I really noticed by looking at the documents of the time is how also the meaning of social security shifted from the very origins to later on. So in the 30s, in the 40s, social security was really something distinguishable and distinct social insurance or other social provision, while later on, especially since the 50s, I see a sort of slippery slope of this concept that tend to be identified more and more with welfare system and social policy at large, while I think the two things should be distinguished. So, for instance, the ILO provided a wealth of studies on the development of social security in Africa, which is also an untrodden field of investigation. And then I would say that a second torsion, another watershed is, of course, the so-called rise of the neoliberal era, where also the goals and the technical provision of social security changed, because also the focus on the international assistance programs changed from the previous period. And yet, why I mentioned the 2001 ILO resolution and conclusion concerning social security? Well, because I think that to some extent, some of the main issues of this founding period were still there. When they say there is no single, specific, and unified mechanism which defines social security, is rather a number of possible provisions which try to adapt this human right to different regional, social, and geographical solutions, which, if we want, is also a way to say, okay, we still, after 80 years, probably it's difficult to come up with a definite and single definition of social security, you see. So it's an open question also for me.
Okay, thanks so much. And so last but not least, just because of the time, I have another question. How and to what amount do international and regional conferences impact the settlement and changes in social security systems around the world?
Yeah. That's also a very, very interesting question. Thank you very much for this. I guess it mainly also depends on the period and on the conference. I try to highlight a few benchmark, a few defining moment. Well, the two conferences of Santiago in 1936 and 1942, for different reasons, are very important. I mean, the CIS was created after the Conference of Santiago in 1942, so they do have a long-lasting impact. I mean, we are in a completely different framework, cultural, political, and international framework than 1942, luckily. and yet we are still here discussing this issue. So also from the intellectual point of view, we can see the relevance of this conference. But also, I would say from the operational point of view, the other conference I mentioned is the first preparatory Asiatic Regional Conference of New Delhi, which really set the standards for the oncoming 20 years of technical assistance programs of the ILO, because it was established that social security can be handled with a regional approach, something that can, by integrating the countries of a region around, gathering them around a set of common issues, common problem, and possible common approach, which was the case of the Asiatic Regional Conference, and also that the technical assistance for this country could be developed, could be supplied with a unified approach. Here, I just mentioned this point. At a certain point, the ILO also wanted to use Egypt as a pilot program for a North African regional approach to social security. So here we are also entering these developmental agendas. So I won't enter into it, but just to say that these kind of regional and international gatherings were very important from both historical and more technical point of view. That's for sure.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. We're trying to do that here at the Inter-American Conference on Social Security. We do that, all of that. We assemble, we do technical assistance and all of that you said just so. Well, regarding the time, we just are short of it. So thank you so much, dear Michele. At the conference, we are very, very grateful and proud to be able to present such wonderful scholars and their studies here. We look forward to continue sharing with you very soon.
Thank you very much. I hope so. I'm grateful. Thanks again for this opportunity.
Thank you. And before we leave, I just want to thank our team at the SIS, especially Miguel Ramirez and his team. You addressed him just earlier, but it's true. Without him, you wouldn't be here and we wouldn't be all here. So thank you so much, Miguel, for your work and your dedication to this. And thank you also to all the team at the SIS, the technical team, the communication team, all of you. Thank you so much for planning and organizing this session. I remind you to follow us on our social media. And our next session would be on the 7th of February, and it will be addressing actuarial and mortality issues. Thank you so much. So we see you soon. Thank you.